Good afternoon to all distinguished speakers and all participants who are joining us today. Today's virtual dialogue on COP27 climate negotiations, Road to Sharm el-Sheikh, is being organized by TERI in association with the Embassy of Egypt, New Delhi, the Center of Excellence for Research and Applied Studies on Climate Change and Sustainable Development at the National Research Center, Egypt. Before we begin, I will just request all speakers online right now to please put on your camera so we can just have a quick photo op and then we can just start with the day's proceedings. Okay, we've taken the photo. Thank you. So without further ado, I will invite Dr. Dhawan, Director General TERI, to deliver the welcome address. Over to you, ma'am.
Thanks, Nivedita.
Speaker, मुझे चल नहीं रहा है.
So I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. So it's give me immense pleasure to welcome you all to the virtual dialogue COP27 climate negotiations, Road to Sharm el-Sheikh. At the onset, I would like to thank Embassy of Egypt, New Delhi, and the Center of Excellence for Research and Applied Studies on Climate Change and Sustainable Development at the National Research Center in Egypt. And my special thanks to the Ambassador, His Excellency, both for visiting TERI, understanding us more, and extending all possible help to us. Thank you so much. I'll also like to put on record our thanks to our partners, that is Bloomberg Philanthropies, the Rockefeller Foundation, German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety and Consumer Protection, and Tata Cleantech Capital Limited for their support. Today's session is being organized as part of the COP27 Compass of Act for Earth initiative, which was launched at the valedictory session of the World Sustainable Development Summit in February this year. Under this initiative, TERI is engaging in research activities which will systematically seek to identify and analyze good practices that can be taken up by the governments for climate action and achieve the sustainable development goals. As part of Act for Earth, the COP27 Compass seeks to bring forward issues pertinent to Global South, which are also of utmost importance with respect to upcoming UNFCCC COP27. With the upcoming COP27 to be held in Sharm el-Sheikh, it becomes important to bring forward issues pertaining to Global South, which are extremely important when we look at the equitable outcomes coming from COP27. The dialogue today will aim to present and deliberate on 4 key themes pertinent to COP27 and beyond, that is global goal on adaptation, climate finance, loss and damage, and global stock taking. We will soon hear on the perspective from the COP27 presidency from His Excellency Ambassador Hamid, Ambassador of Egypt to India. The discussions today will feed into a policy brief which will be launched during COP27. With this, I'd like to hand over the event proceedings to my colleague Nivedita. Nivedita, over to you. And thanks to all the participants for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dhawan. I will now invite Ambassador Manjeev Puri, Distinguished Fellow TERI, to take over the next segment of the discussion today.
Nivedita, thank you very much. Dr. Dhawan, first of all, a very big thank you to you personally, to TERI. Your Excellency, you would recall that we met you at the height of the COVID pandemic. We came across to the embassy and we told you that you will never see the end of us. So thank you very much for being with us and thank you for your lovely smile. I'm very delighted to see you on the screen. Your Excellency, you know, each of us there is my dear colleague here, Mr. Rashmi, who's a distinguished fellow of TERI, like me, a very old hand in these negotiations. So are many of my colleagues here from TERI, etc. If we want to get into narrating our things, let me tell you, this webinar will not be enough. But today we have gathered, and I believe we have gathered, we are perhaps the first to have gathered here to hear from you. The presidency of the COP is with Egypt. You have the steering wheel in your hand. You have, as they say, the rudder with you. And we want to hear from you. I'm sure our friends and colleagues in the government are preparing themselves, the briefs, the requirements of the agenda as is unfolding. But I am a very convinced old-time believer that individuals matter, leadership matters, and that, sir, is squarely in your hands today. So, Excellency, we would very much look forward to hearing you and your colleagues on the Egyptian ideas for COP27. Now, you know, Nivedita and Dr. Dhawan have already mentioned to you ideas which are on this sort of agenda. The global goal for adaptation, the issue of climate finance, the global stocktake and loss and damage. Let me add one from my side, because we had the European Commissioner for Energy here with us the other day. And the only thing that she was interested in talking to us in India, and I'm sure with all of you, including in Egypt, was the issue of a just transition in the energy area. So I leave all these ideas with you. Your Excellency, in a minute, I will hand over the screen to you. But I want to say that I am particularly delighted that from India, we have a representative at a senior level from the Ministry of Finance, who I hope will enlighten us with the Indian ideas on something which Prime Minister Modi himself spoke about in Glasgow, the huge and tremendous need for climate finance. But I want to specially welcome friends and colleagues from Cairo. I believe that Dr. Amra Abdul Aziz Fatah Ali will enlighten us about the new NDCs from Egypt. I am happy to have Dr. Sharif Dawood. And if you don't mind my saying so, of course, it's a lady. That's something I deeply respect. But I'm particularly delighted that Maryam Alam, the presidential advisor to the president for the COP from the foreign ministry, is here. Your Excellency, whichever way we may look at it, we may talk about depoliticizing things. We may speak that this is a technical issue and should be handled by those who are involved with the technical side. The fact of the matter is the linkages between greenhouse gases, use of energy, GDP, and if I may use the simple expression, where countries stand in the global power play, has certainly made climate change one of the most important strategic negotiations undertaken by the whole globe. And I stress this fact, the whole globe together. And so therefore, I think you and me, our profession is perhaps at the fore. Many may not have liked it. Your Excellency, I want to stop here. I would be very happy to hear all your colleagues. We have a hard stop at 2:45 Indian Standard Time, which means roughly about 7 minutes per speaker. My request to everyone is please try and adhere to that. And Nivedita, when people come at 6 minutes, please ring a bell or do something so that the speaker gets alerted to it. Your Excellency, I think I've already overshot my 7 minutes. That's my prerogative as the chair. But I want to invite you and say the screen is yours. Thank you so much for all that you have done in your collaboration with TERI. We very much look forward to hearing from your colleagues today. Your Excellency, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Manjeev Puri, and also Dr. V. Badawan. I really have to start by saying that I will not wear out my welcome. I will not speak for more than 2 or 3 minutes. I don't consider myself to be an expert on environmental issues. So I will leave this up to my colleagues from the Egyptian side, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who represent the COP27. I think they will be in a much better position to speak about the priorities of the Egyptian side. But let me start by saying that Egypt is holding COP27 this year in a very complicated political and economic international scene. The current global energy and food crisis cause enormous suffering to many developing countries, particularly with the accumulation of debt, the poor flow of funds, and supply chain disruption. This places extreme responsibilities and very heavy responsibilities on our shoulders to ensure that these difficulties will not impact the pace of implementation of our common vision to address climate change, which was reflected in the Paris Agreement and confirmed last year in Glasgow. And here it is clear that there is a strong linkage between the issues of climate change and the issues of development and finance. And as a matter of fact, if we really think about it, we'll find that the real problem here is how we're going, no matter how many initiatives we will come up with, no matter how many projects we will be able to agree on, our mission is not going to be successful unless we are able to summon and mobilize sufficient funding for these projects and particularly from the donor countries and developed countries that have the ability to play a constructive role in this. I remember it was agreed in 2015 that developed countries are going to contribute up to 100 billion US dollars by the year 2020, and yearly. This is a yearly number, and of course, until now we haven't seen. In the best estimates, we have reached something like 80%. Some other estimates say that we only have reached 20% or maybe a little bit higher than that. Under any circumstances, we have not reached sufficient funding to put all our plans and all our projects to implement them and to see them actually starting to gain momentum and have shape. And I think this is one of the main things that is going to be tackled in COP27. What we have seen over the past year, especially since the beginning of this year, is that no one is immune from environmental change and environmental degradation. We have seen extreme weather conditions across the globe. We have seen droughts in some places, and we have seen floods in some other places. We have seen extreme cold in some areas, and we have seen extreme in some other areas. And so, not surprising, as a matter of fact, we find that many countries that thought of themselves as immune from these kind of phenomena are actually starting to feel that they are bitten by these problems to a degree that they have never expected and never anticipated before. So at the end of the day, we are all on the same boat together. We are facing the same problems. And even if we are not facing the same problems today, I guess every one of us in the summer, in the hot summer of still, I think it's hot here in India and it's hot still in Cairo as well. Most of us are sitting in air-conditioned rooms, but there are people who are suffering. And I'm afraid that if we don't, as international community, if we don't come together and really put our hands together and start doing something for this 10, 15 years from now, our kids are going to be the ones who are suffering. So it is our duty from today to put our hands together to give the world a strong wake-up call. Let's work together and do something. Otherwise, if we wake up years from now, it will be too late. So this is the time that we actually sit together and start making progress on these issues with the help not only of our policymakers, but also of other developing countries who have to contribute to this because they are not immune, as I said before. So the scientific part of environmental change has been proven. Now, the economic part is what needs to all countries and all parties to put hand together. And I was personally extremely happy to visit TERI just 10 days ago, and of course, under the guidance of Dr. Viva Devan, I have seen what TERI can contribute to the issue of environmental change. I have seen the projects, and I have seen a lot of efforts that are being put in place in order for us to be able to, in order for India and TERI to be able to help with climate change. And maybe one of the issues that particularly were interesting to me, I spoke to Dr. Devan about this, is the idea of having a center of excellence for green hydrogen. This is something that I think is going to be extremely important with the increasing relevance of green hydrogen as a renewable and sustainable form of energy. I think this is something that is going to be extremely important, especially that Egypt over the past two or 3 months has already signed to a round of understanding with Indian companies to have their own green hydrogen projects in Egypt. So I think this is one of the areas that we can put our hands together in and that we can work forward on the path of realizing these two projects, but I'm also still looking forward to more engagement between Egypt and India when it comes to this particular field, which has become increasingly important to Egypt. And obviously, India has a lot to give when it comes to green hydrogen and renewable energy. So one more time, let me assure you, Ambassador Puri, that I'm very happy that we will will always be in contact. I do remember that TERI was one of the first institutes that I dealt with upon my arrival here in India last year, and I will still be looking forward to more engagements. And this also goes to Dr. Devan, who has graciously welcomed us to TERI last week. So one more time, thank you very much. And now I understand that we have Ms. Maryam Al-Lam, Dr. Sharif Dawood, and Dr. Amr Abdelaziz from the Egyptian side. They can speak much better about the COP27 and the vision of Egypt when it comes to this particular conference. So I am sure that I'm leaving you in safe hands and hands that can actually guide you and take you through the rest of the topics that we'll have to cover today. And I wish you all success in this video conference. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Your Excellency, thank you very much. You started off by saying that you were not an expert, but thank you for this expert exposition. You touched on everything important. Collaboration, money, economy, and the fact that everybody needs to realize that climate change is there today for them, not just for the others. You know, in India, recent floods in Bangalore have had some of the rich and mighty of this country having to sit in boats and ply through the ground floors of their multi-million-dollar houses. These are realities of life. I'm very glad, Excellency, that you've highlighted all of this. We in TERI look forward to a continued collaboration with the Egyptian side, with your embassy and counterparts and colleagues. Thank you very much for your words. They were truly, let me say, encompassing and important for us. Your Excellency, let me take you on and stick to the area from where you and I come, the diplomatic side of things. I want to welcome Maryam Alam, the presidential advisor in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on this entire subject. Madam, I think both the ambassador and I have been stating the same, but it is left to you to flesh out the thoughts that we have left on the screen at this particular moment. I am not seeing you on the video. I hope she is there.
So sorry to interrupt. So she's not joined us yet. We're following up. You can go ahead with Abhishek. He's here.
Okay, so no, let's give the Egyptians a chance. Is Dr. Sharif Dawood there?
No, sir.
And
Actually,
or Dr. Amra Abdelaziz?
Not yet. No.
No one there.
I think there's some connectivity.
Well,
might be connectivity issue.
Connectivity issue. Look, these things happen. Abhishek, welcome here. Sometimes as the host, and you're part of all of us, we have to step in, pitch up, and this particular webinar, I'm sure, is being seen by hundreds, if not thousands of people across the world, given TERI's strong credibility in the subject. The ambassador mentioned something in a very long word called finance. And, you represent that ministry. But the basic issues, which he perhaps didn't use the word, is the entire question of money, economy. And I think we can't be better illuminated in this webinar without hearing a person who's hands-on and actually dealing with this. Abhishek, the screen is yours. Thank you very much for finding the time for us. We deeply appreciate your presence.
Respected Ambassador Majid Puri, His Excellency Ambassador Wael Ahmed, thank you very much. And I also extend my greetings to the esteemed panelists. I hope I'm clearly audible because I'm logging in from my home network.
Abhishek, like all of us, we are in the same boat, if I may say so. But you're welcome, and you've got your very strong connectivity. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So, as you have mentioned, as also Ambassador, His Excellency Ambassador has mentioned, that the finance is the one of the most, if not the most important pillar in the entire climate change architecture. And in the past few COPs and the past few trends that we have seen, that the commitments by the developed country parties towards their financial obligation, be it the provision, the mobilization, the flow, all the three aspects, they have fallen short to their commitments. Talking about the $100 billion per year goal, We have seen from the biennial assessment reports, we have seen from numerous other assessments that the $100 billion goal has nowhere been being met by the developed country parties. Now, the second aspect that comes is the new collective quantified goals under the Paris Agreement. Basically, what we need to emphasize is that the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities must be ensured, as these are the two cardinal pillar points of the UNFCCC. In this regard, I would like to mention that the financial obligations of the developed country parties through the new collective goals should be based upon 4 points that I would like to mention. What is the quantitative point, the qualitative, the temporal, and the evolving mechanism? On the quantitative aspect, we have seen from the needs determination report by the Standing Committee on Finance, which was presented in the last COP as well, that the need by the developing country parties for their climate action is enormous and it's running in trillions. Just to give the very basic example of India's first NDC, I'm talking about just before the NDC has been updated. India's NDC needed $2.5 trillion to actualize the climate commitments that we have taken into account. Therefore, the climate actions that the developing countries need to actualize is contingent upon the financial mobilization, provision, and flow commitments met by the developed country parties. Second aspect that I have mentioned is the qualitative aspect, which means that the financial mobilization and provision has to be based on a concessional finance, be it grant, be it hugely concessionalized loans, because the entire regime, if we follow the Article 4.3 of the convention, it says that the finance provided by the developed country parties has to take into account the full cost and incremental cost of the climate action by developed countries. Therefore, it is imperative that the developed country parties, should provide concessional finance to the greatest extent. Third point is the temporal angle that I would like to mention, is how fast these things are needed to move. Because as of now, the $100 billion goal was up to 2020. Now it has been dragged up to 2025. The new collective quantified goal is starting from 2025. And right now we are just in the process of discussion. Therefore, it has to be based on the needs and requirements of the developing countries. And as we have seen, as you have mentioned, sir, that the climate vagaries are increasing day by day in the countries, especially the countries like India. We are facing the climate vagaries each and every day. Therefore, if the climate finance obligations by developed country parties through finance and technology provisions are not met, this would be a humongous task for us to maintain our developmental commitments and also maintain the climate commitment in a very balanced manner. Finally, I would like to talk about the evolving mechanism. The evolving mechanisms of the new collective goal and the climate finance goals should be based upon a changing mechanism which should take into account the changing parameters of the needs and requirements of developing country parties, because every year, every 6 months, our climate vagaries are increasing and the financial requirements are changing according to our needs and requirements. Therefore, these 4 parameters, which should be the base of climate finance mobilization and provision, should be adhered to, and the scope, scale, and speed of the climate finance provision and mobilization has to be increased by C-fold. So I would like to stop here and thank you for the opportunity to express the financial perspective that we have over here. Thank you very much.
Abhishek, thank you very, very much. I want to really thank you for being very clear, and both not only in your understanding but in your exposition, because that's very important. On a lighter note, since we happen to have a few minutes, let me tell you that Mr. R.R. Rashmi and I had the honor of sitting at a small table in Copenhagen, where President Obama was at the other end of the table, on this issue of finance. And remember, the UNFCCC started by saying that full additional costs of climate change actions by developing countries would be met by the developed world. 2009, fast forward from 1992, we come to Copenhagen. So two figures were flaunted. One was the figure of $30 billion for 2 years, 2010, 2012. And then there was a figure of $100 billion. That was for the period up to 2020. You know, frankly, it was in the future. It doesn't matter. Let me tell you what happened on the $30 billion. As it was about to be agreed, President Obama was whispered something in his ear, and he had to tell people that, no, I can't agree to a figure of 30 billion. Everybody looked up and said, sir, after all these negotiations, what has happened? And he said, it's not in his remit, but that of Congress. So the word approaching was put on there. I smile and I say that as far as finance is concerned, we've continued to go by the word approaching. In Paris, it became all countries contribute. And in Glasgow was the ultimate coup de grace, as they say. Regret, sorry, we can't do it. So Abhishek, you are absolutely right on what you are saying. These are negotiations we shall carry on. I am told that Dr. Amra Abdul Aziz Fatah Ali has joined. Is that correct, Nivedita?
So not yet. We have Dr. Sharif.
Would you have Dr. Sharif Dawood on the line?
Yes, he's there.
Dr. Dawood, welcome from Cairo. This is New Delhi calling here. Can you hear me? Dr. Sharif Dawood,
So
are you there?
He's on mute.
Can you?
So, Dr. Sharif, can you hear? You send the request.
I guess Dr. Sharif Dawood was asked to join an emergency meeting with the minister, and he told me he is going to join back as long as he is going back shortly.
And Dr. Amra Abdul Aziz?
No, sir, we're just checking the panelists. No, not yet.
Neither is Maryam Alam there.
No, she has connectivity issue. So she's, I think, in a remote location.
Well, anyway, you try. We have about 20 odd minutes. So are most of the people here around from India? Is that true?
So yes, we can go. We can make the presentation. Sorry. We can make the presentation next.
Yes. No, please do. Because I think let's utilize the time well. Please go ahead and make the presentation. Nivedita, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Puri. I'm going to share my screen.
Please go ahead and beam.
I hope you can see my screen.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nivedita. I'm part of the author team presenting the policy dialogue on the COP27 climate negotiation road to Sharm el-Sheikh. As Dr. Dhawan mentioned and Anuradha mentioned, Act for Earth was launched at the WSG's 2022 valedictory session, and its objective was to drive ambitious and urgent action through two components, COP Compass and SDG Charter. The main objective of COP Compass is to amplify perspectives from the global south crucial for equitable climate action. As we all know, there is a scientific consensus that there is a need for urgent and ambitious action, and from all parts of the world. The developed world is expected to provide the technical assistance, financial assistance to the developing world, which are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. To give a sort of context, in terms of cumulative CO2 emissions for the G20 countries, India contributes only 3.2%, while United States, European Union, China, Germany, United Kingdom are all before India. In terms of the per capita CO2 emissions for G20 countries, India is actually at the lowest end of the spectrum, with the world average at 4.2 tons per person, while India has only 1.9 tons per person. We all know that the remaining carbon budget is very low, and according to it, if there is 83% likelihood of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we just have 7.5 years left from the remaining carbon budget. And if our limit is of achieving 2 degrees Celsius, then we just have 22.5 years with the remaining carbon budget. So the key issues addressed in this policy brief is the urgency to act to achieve the Paris temperature goals, achieving the twin goals of urgent climate action and equity, and the urgency of international response. The way this policy brief and the policy dialogue has been structured is that we have identified key issues pertinent to Global South in terms of policy processes, including global goal on adaptation, loss and damage, climate finance, and global Stocktake. We went through a review of literature and an overview of key processes, and have come up together. And together we've come up with some of the recommendations. So the first issue is climate finance, and I hand it over to Soham to take it from here.
Thank you, Nivedita. I'm Soham Banerjee. I work in the area of climate finance here in TERI. Good afternoon to everyone who is joining from India, and good morning to anyone who is joining from Egypt. So I will be particularly focusing on two aspects of climate finance here. One, which already Mr. Abhishek Acharya has brilliantly explained, which is on new collective quantified goal on climate finance, and the second is on long-term climate finance. So focusing on the first, so this is an ad hoc program which will run up to COP29 in 2024 to initiate the new collective goal. As Mr. Acharya also mentioned, I'd like to echo that same point that there's a huge discourse which ran in Glasgow, and the results which came out is that the 100 billion target was more on the political side, and it lacked a sense of scientific coherence, and also the needs for developing nations was not incorporated, and that's how this new collective goal concept arise. Furthermore, I think there's a huge importance to link this to the existing articles of the Paris Agreement, in particular to Article 2, Article 9, Article 14, etc., to make it more coherent and make it more scientific. As of now, it's also an established fact that climate finance remains disproportionately allocated towards mitigation actions, which the new collective goal can bridge this gap. Some of the recommendations which came out from the literature is that to make this program more coherent is that to create an ad hoc technical committee under the UNFCCC to look into the nitty-gritties of the program, to mandate a technical process led by the subsidiary body of implementation, to bring in a sense of rule of law, and finally to establish a work program on the new collective quantified goal, as in similar lines which of the work program which launched in COP17 in Durban. Moving quickly on to the long-term finance. The long-term finance is aimed at progressing on the mobilization and scaling of climate finance, and the sources can be from a variety of sources like public, private, bilateral, multilateral, and alternative sources. So this long-term finance concept came into 2009 in Copenhagen, where developed countries promised to provide 100 billion climate finance to developing nations by the year 2020. However, as the panelist and Ambassador Puri also mentioned, that in Glasgow it came out that this target has been failed, and hence the period has been extended to 2023, which is 3 years post Glasgow. India also announced several targets, including the net zero by 2050, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi also suggested $1 trillion from developing nations, which needs to be deployed to be in line with the targets. Lastly, again, the recommendation portions. There needs to be a restructuring organization and governance to enhance transparency. Sorry. Yeah, and moving on, there need to be enhanced financial institutional capacity, and lastly, there needs to be transparency on delivering and usage of climate finance. So now I'd like to hand over the floor to Nivedita to take the presentation forward.
Thanks, Om. Moving on to the concept of loss and damage, while the concept of loss and damage found mention in the UNFCCC only at COP7 in Marrakesh, the concerns over the potential losses and damage from climate change impacts started in 1991 when, on the behalf of AOSIS countries, Vanuatu submitted a proposal to the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, which proposed two things: to set up an international fund as well as for a separate international pool. Insurance pool. But when the UNFCCC was set up, there was no mention of either a fund or any insurance mechanism. So some of the major milestones achieved for loss and damage was, like I said, at COP7, insurance-related actions was mentioned in the decision text. At COP13, the phrase found a mention for the first time. At COP19 in Warsaw, the international mechanism was set up to fulfill the role under the Convention for addressing loss and damage. And at COP25 in Madrid, the Santiago Network was launched under Warsaw International Mechanism to step up the technical assistance. The functions for the Santiago Network were further agreed upon in Glasgow at COP26 for the effective implementations of the functions of the Warsaw International Mechanism and for carrying out technical assistance from relevant organizations, bodies, networks, and experts. Some of the key proposals from the Global South on the Santiago Network, which came out from the proposals submitted by various country groups as well as countries from Global South, was that there is a need for a loss and damage needs assessment. Any such assessment must be demand-driven and set in context with each of the country's circumstances. This would be helpful so that the capacity can be built at the national level itself to develop policies and recommendations to anticipate any loss and damage and submit requests for assistance, including for rehabilitation and recovery. Financing loss and damage. While there has been a constant ask from the Global South for funding, not just for loss and damage, but for other key issues as well, a separate dedicated funding channel for Santiago Network is one major ask across Global South countries. The third issue was the Secretariat for the Santiago Network, which is the coordinating unit and will provide the administrative and infrastructural support. Countries from the Global South, including the group, African Group for Negotiators, the Latin American countries, the Republic of Uganda, Republic of Indonesia, and Bangladesh, are of the view that the Secretariat should be hosted within the UNFCCC to make things more transparent. But most of the countries from the Global North differ in this in their stance, wherein they're keen to support a coordinating unit which is placed outside and independent of the UNFCCC process, as they believe that an organization which is outside of UNFCCC would have more capacity and relevant networks. So some of the recommendations that came out very clearly was, like I said, there needs to be a loss and damage assessment to fully and effectively operationalize the functions of Santiago Network. There is a need for an increased role of organizations, bodies, networks, and experts And especially these experts should come from the developing countries as well as those which are particularly vulnerable to the countries to the impacts of climate change. They should advise the coordinating body or the secretariat in providing technical assistance and indicate the expertise available. Um, Coordinate resources required for Santiago network in order to ensure the smooth functioning of the network. The secretariat must play a very active role in mobilizing and maintaining a steady flow of resources, which includes financial, technical, and human. Uh, these resources must be readily available and easily accessible by those who need it the most. And lastly, putting loss and damage on the COP27 agenda. Uh, this prevents the issue from being discussed at the sidelines and can be taken up at the highest level. Now I hand it over to Saheli to take up the global goal on adaptation.
I say, can we just pause this a little bit? We, with some difficulty, have connectivity established with Cairo, and we have Dr. Amra Ali here with us. So I think it would be a bit good for all of us in India to listen to him, because he has all the details on the Egyptian NDC and is someone who will be a key player in terms of what will actually happen in Sharm el-Sheikh and in the hands of the presidency. Dr. Amra Abdulaziz Fatah Ali, are you there, sir? Can you hear me? Dr. Amra. Nivedita, do you have the connection or not?
Hello, good morning.
He's there.
Dr. Amra. Good morning to you in Cairo, sir. This is good afternoon from New Delhi. Hello.
So he's there. I think it's a low network. He's there. It's unmuted also. Just can't.
Can you hear him? Can he hear us? We did hear him say good afternoon to us, good morning to us.
Mr. Ambassador, can I just make a small intervention? Can we kindly ask who from the Egyptian side is available online now and jump directly to the presentation that the Egyptian side would be willing to give, irrespective of the sequence? Because obviously we have some connectivity problems, and I don't think this is, if we go in sequence, maybe we will not reach much. So if there is anybody from the Egyptian side is here, please tell us that you are.
Thank you, Excellency. That's exactly what we are doing. Very most grateful to you.
Good morning, Your Excellency. Good morning, Your Excellency as well, and all of the attendees. I'm Tariq Imraz. I'm a professor at Suez Canal University, but I'm not representing the Egyptian government. But I was attending the COP26 and going to attend COP27. So I'm here and I'm trying to connect with my other colleagues at the different ministries, but it seems there is either an emergent meeting or there is a problem, but I'm trying to connect with all of them.
Okay, in the meantime, and until we have someone who can actually represent the vision of the COP27 presidency from the Egyptian side, do you have anybody else who's willing to make an intervention from the Egyptian side?
Maryam Alam is on, but she cannot unmute herself. Maryam Alam, yeah, she just mentioned, she just sent me a message saying she cannot raise her hand or unmute herself.
Thank you. We've Ms. Maryam, we see you. You can try now to unmute.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon and welcome.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Very audible.
First of all, I would like to apologize for the background noise as I'm currently in the EMS meeting in Senegal. And a brief introduction, my name is Maryam, and I've been
Did we lose Miss Maryam again? Hello, Miss Alem? I don't think. Ah, again, we have connectivity issues here. So other than, here we are.
Yes, I don't know if
Maryam, you are not only there, we can see you very clearly. Please go ahead.
so. You can hear me as well.
Yes, very clearly. Please go ahead.
That's fantastic. Apologies, I have just joined. Are there specific questions you want me to address? What would you like me to address at this very point in time?
So Maryam, we are having this webinar anchored here in India, and our basic interests are to hear from you major Egyptian priorities for the COP as the presidency. You are free to share whatever you wish to say, because we respect that very much and think it will educate us a lot. So let me say the screen is yours for about 5-7 minutes. Then we are at the end of this seminar. But your presence is very welcome and deeply appreciated.
As well as the
No, this is not working properly.
No, I think Your Excellency, I think you have been more than, let me say, comprehensive in putting forth the Egyptian position. We shall try and schedule something again in a few days' time when things perhaps work out. Not an issue. These things do happen with all of this. Maybe Nivedita, we can finish the presentation and then move on to the panel, as we've almost reached their time.
Sure, thank you, Pastor.
My
Your
name
Excellency,
is
thank you very
Professor
much
Fagr.
for all your help, sir.
My name is Professor Fagr. I'm the co-chair for the next session. But Dr. Amr Abdelaziz is with us now, and I believe he can talk as well.
Well, we would be very delighted, ma'am, for him to make his presentation.
Dr. Amr, can you hear us?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Dr. Amr, the screen is yours.
This is Amr Abdelaziz. I'm the Mitigation Director here in Ministry of Environment in Egypt.
Pleased to meet you, sir. Please go ahead and give us the vision of the Ministry of Environment of Egypt on COP27. We'll appreciate it.
I'm prepared. They asking me to present something about the NDC, the updated NDC for the Egypt, and I'm not here to talk about the COP27. Maybe there is we can organize another meeting for this issue, but I'm preparing something about the NDC. If it's applicable to explain what in this document, or what you recommend, Ambassador?
I think it will be very applicable. We have the NDCs of Egypt as well as the revised NDCs of India as well. So I think this will be a good opportunity to see to what extent we see eye to eye and to what extent we have shared vision on environmental issues. So we do appreciate if you kindly present us with the Egyptian NDCs. Thank you.
Okay. Do you allow me to share my presentation?
Please go ahead, sir.
Okay. Migrating to and my appreciation for the organizer and the participant for in this dialogue. And thank you for having me in this session, which will be about the Egypt's first updated nationally determined contribution, NDC 2030. Egypt submitted its intended nationally determined contribution in November 2015 to achieve the global targets set out in the UNFCCC Paris Agreement after Egypt signed the Paris Agreement on April 2016 and ratified it in June 2017. The INDC was considered Egypt's first NDC. This document presents an update to Egypt's first NDC, covering the period between 2015 till 2030. Egypt updated NDC in line with Egypt's developmental and climate change strategies. Egypt's update NDC outlines contains national context revision highlights action taken to implement INDC since 2015, pathways to Egypt's 2030 mitigation target in all the targeted sectors, contribution to climate change adaptation, means of implementation, and MRV, and finally the annexes. The action taken to implement the first NDC since 2015, Egypt faced a multitude of development challenges that were further increased by the negative impacts of climate change and associated strain on the national budget, as well as the need to address the economic impacts of the COVID pandemic. Nevertheless, Egypt was still able to implement a wide range of climate policies and projects, which are delighted in this document.
Hmm. Do we still have Dr. Amr with us?
Yes, he's there. Yes.
Well,
Do you hear me?
if you please repeat maybe the last 2 minutes, Dr. Amr would appreciate it because we lost the connectivity for some time.
Okay, I'm talking about the action taken to implement the first NDC since 2015, and the challenges what Egypt faced in from the increased negative impacts of climate change and the associated strain on the national budget, as well as the need to address the climate impacts of the COVID-19. Nevertheless, Egypt was still able to implement a wide range of climate policies and projects which are delighted in this document. As a result, it reflects Egypt's ambitious contribution to global efforts, despite the neglected contribution of the Egypt's share, which is around 0.6% of the global emission. These activities like the energy efficiency reforms, renewable energy, energy efficiency in electricity sector, energy efficiency and low carbon fuel in petroleum sector, energy efficiency on demand side, low carbon transport, solid waste management, green finance, climate adaptation actions. The side of the mitigation actions to 2030, it is firstly the electricity generation, transmission, and distribution sector was with a reduction target of around 70 megaton CO2 equivalent, which represents a 33% decrease from the business as usual scenario. Install additional renewable energy generation capacity to reach the electricity power contribution target of 42% by 2035 and renewable energy capacity of 40% by 2030. This includes the replacement of coal scenarios and inefficient thermal power plants, transform to smart grid and expansion of regional electricity interconnections, improve the energy efficiency of electricity generation plants, activation of the role of electricity distribution companies in energy efficiency, and promotion of the decentralized renewable energy system for subscribers, improve and update the transmission and distribution network. In the oil and gas sector, the quantitative target recovered and utilization of association gas generated from the cured oil fields, access to clean fuel, natural gas in household, no-cost energy efficiency measures in petroleum companies, manufacture of degradable plastic bags, and convert plastic waste into oil as an intermediary product to produce polyethylene, produce medium density wood panels, MDF from rice, extraction of algae oil from use in the production of biofuel and generation of bioethanol. Transport sector with a reduction target of around 9 megaton CO2 equivalent, which represents 7% decrease from the business as usual scenario. It includes the expansion in Cairo Metro. Hello? You hear me?
Please go ahead.
The activity in the transport sector include the expansion in Cairo Metro network, development of Alexandria Metro, and rehabilitation of the tram line, operation of new capital monorail and 6 October monorail, light rail transit, LRT, electric trains, and rapid electric trains, transformation of public buses and to operate on a lower carbon incentive fuel and bus rapid transit BRT system, implement the national road project, greening of the civil aviation sector. Other sectors, non-quantitative targets, policies and measures. Industry sector, implement measures in the low carbon roadmap for the Egyptian cement industry, enhance electrical and thermal energy efficiency in other resources in intensive sectors and SMEs. Motors system optimization program has been initiated to replace old inefficient motors with IE3 or higher motors. Apply sector-specific process improvements such as the transformation of the charcoal sector from traditional open pits into mechanized kiln, promote eco-industrial parks concept to scale up resources efficiency through intra-firm exchanges, improvement of economic, environmental, and social performance of business, and creation of green industry, building and urban cities, promote the use of renewable energy in existing and new establishments, expand on energy efficiency label and specification, of appliance programs and implementation of non-energy efficient equipment, promote green buildings by activating the energy efficiency codes, adopting voluntary green buildings guidelines, and roll out incentives to encourage the use of best available technologies for sustainable buildings, increase green spaces, and sustainable parks in new cities that are irrigated with retreated wastewater, adopt the national active mobility strategy to encourage citizens to use bicycle, shift gradually to electric vehicles, and establishment of the necessary infrastructure inside cities, install energy efficiency and/or solar-operated street lighting in the context of the adaptation actions to 2030. The first, wastewater and irrigation, rehabilitation of 2,000 kilometers of irrigation canals for agriculture climate resilience. Beneficiary will be about 60 million people. Renewable waste desalination of about 4 million quadrat meter daily. Beneficiary will be about 33 million people. In the agriculture sector, adaptation of crop production in the Nile Valley and Delta. The beneficiary will be about 10 million people. On farm irrigation in old lands, beneficiary will be about 6 million people. Modernizing or on-farm practice for climate resilience, beneficiary will be about 1.75 million people. Crop yield increases from 10 to 15%. Coastal zone, adaptation of the northern delta affected by sea level rise. Beneficiary will be about 10 million people. Natural protection of Rosetta shoreline using the sand motor. Beneficiary will be 4.25 million people. Irrigation of coastal protection in 3 Egyptian Mediterranean cities. Beneficiary will be about 6 million people. The urban development and tourism protectorates to cover 17% of the national marine and wildlife area, sustainable parks in new cities from 5 to 20 faddans. And finally, the means of implementation. The support needed for mitigation efforts is about 196 billion US dollar, and the adaptation efforts need around 50 billion US dollars, with the total financial support needed are 246 US dollars. This NDC updated is Egypt's pledged for climate actions up to 2030, and depending on the international financial support, ensure that the transition and appropriate to national capabilities under the umbrella of sustainable development. The actual implementation of these mitigation and adaptation measures are conditional on the provision of adequate appropriate international finance through highly consensual finance and grants as appropriate. Thank you.
Dr. Amra, thank you very, very much. This was very comprehensive. And I think you've highlighted all the points which, let me assure you, you have said so from the specificity of your country, but believe me, are common to almost all countries in the developing world. Very well said, sir. Most grateful to you for this. Nivedita, do we have at all any more time for our opening session, or do we move on to the panel?
So we need to finish the presentation and then move on to the panel. The last 3 slides are left.
Okay, would you please ask someone to do that? And then I see that the colleagues who are doing the panel are waiting. Your Excellency, Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for being there and for helping and assisting in putting this together. As I said, we from TERI will continue to interact with you closely over at least the coming 2 months and thereafter. Thank you.
Please do that as often as you would like. We are there for you, and our collaboration is not going to end here. Actually, it's going to continue in much more endeavors over the coming period. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Excellency.
Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Nivedita, please continue.
Thank you, sir. We're going to continue with the presentation now.
I'm Saida, and is Associate Fellow from TERI. So I've during the climate change, to measure climate change, there are 2 strategies actually to combat climate change. So we have the mitigation strategies in a quantifiable way, but for the adaptation strategies, we don't have that goal at global level, anything in quantifiable. So till COP27, 26, so there is no such framework or there is no such discussion happened. So when in COP26, nations came to sign the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh program, then they are started discussing on global goal on adaptation. So which focuses mostly enhancing understanding of global goal of adaptation, contributing review of overall progress, and adaptation communication through understanding how it is the regions are vulnerable to climate change. So here till now we already had 2 workshops under the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program. So in the first workshop, the participants actually mentioned address some few key points, key characteristics on which we should focus. One is long-term orientation, responding mostly urgent and immediate adaptation responses. Then the context, it should be the GGA, that is the global goal on adaptation. It should be context specific and also be country driven, and mostly focusing on the local and indigenous knowledge, and also addressing the climate vulnerable groups, women and youth. So based on this key characteristics pointed in the first workshop, and also
several countries actually proposed few frameworks based on context-specific decision-making, and also outcome input, output, and outcome-based indicators, both at qualitative and quantitative methods. So, based on this, recommend whatever the work has done, we are proposing a monitoring and evaluating system as a framework, since adaptation can't be captured in a one single indicator. So we propose that in an ideal framework should incorporate three types of indicators: input indicators, output indicators, and outcome indicators. So input indicators are based on mostly the active-based responses indicators. Output indicators are mostly institutional readiness and climate risk management indicators, and outcome indicators are mostly impact indicators. So in the input indicators, we are focusing mostly on the infrastructure side of the health services, that number of trained health workers or services providers to 1 lakh climate vulnerable communes. Then the infrastructure for early warning system, that number of communes per 1 lakh climate vulnerable communes get information in hand, before in hand, about the climate change or climate extremes. Then number of then infrastructure structure for promoting community-based social platforms and indigenous practices. Then also infrastructure for job training programs, so that the vulnerable climate in the vulnerable climate regions, people diversify their income through the training process. And also we are focusing on the nature-based solutions and also quick evacuation, so that like if something happens, climate extreme happens, then less time should be taken for that. So for that also we need infrastructure. The output indicators are mostly the indicators based on mainstreaming climate adaptation into our NDCs, national adaptation plans, and also development plans at local level, national level, and also global level. Then also, then we are the government, the number of governments, how the number of governments adopted and implemented national disaster risk reduction strategies, and also the local government. So we need to track all that. And also the climate funds released and disbursed for different infrastructures, we whatever we are talking about in the input as a input indicators. And the outcome indicators uh, is the impact indicators we are focusing on. So there we have the indicator for improvement of the climate vulnerable communes in terms of their health, income level, consumption level, health services, then their also their education level. So we need to focus on that also. And as a social security net, we need to fund through the climate funds for the climate vulnerable regions and communes, and also for some reservation policies for women and climate vulnerable communes should be there in the workplace, public sector employment, and education. So yeah, these are some sample indicators we are proposing, and I'm inviting Shubhi for the next section.
Hello everyone, I'm Shubhi. I work in climate finance team with TERI. So I'll be taking out the last issue that we would like to raise in this COP27 that talks about global stocktake, which we thought will be an important issue to talk about and see where the recommendations can come up from developing nations. So talking about global stocktake, the mechanism was introduced in late December 2015 at COP21. However, it has been discussed from way long back, from earlier 2015 as well, but it came up in COP in 2015. However, it took little delay, like in 2018 it was being formalized. So finally we have global stocktake place in year 2018. So this talks about and is coming under Article 14 of Paris Agreement, where the global stocktake would take the stock of Paris Agreement as implementing tool, and where there will be a collective progress assessment which will aim to achieve the long-term goals which will be presented in the Paris Agreement. So the key purpose of global stocktake is to inform all the parties about updating their national determined contributions, that is NDC. Coming to the timeline when and how the global stocktake will process in near future is that since I introduced it was formalized in 2018. However, the recent COP26 in Glasgow, the rule book came out about the global stocktake, what it is, how the people will be working, and how different countries will take part. And there are different phases that was being introduced in the rule book. So these phases will be reaching out, or the countries have already started working this year, that is year 2022. That is, they're already working on phase 1 and phase 2, and in the subsequent year in 2023, the phase 3 will be introduced. And subsequently, every 5 years, that is the next global stocktake will come in year 2023. So when we talk about phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, what exactly each nation has to present is explained in this particular slide. So firstly, the information collection and preparation stage comes up in phase 1, where all developed countries have to have some efforts to help developing nations and support them technically, as well as transfer some finance to support them, which my colleagues has already talked about in their subsequent slide when Soham was talking about climate finance. Then how it will also enhance the transparency framework. And lastly, how we can refer each of our reports specifically to adaptation. That was very well explained by Nivedana. The second phase talks about technical assessment, which will be done in year 2020, which is being done in year 2022 with phase 1, that is when we are collecting the information and doing the preparation for that. So this has some technical assessment that should be looked after, that is how developing countries' efforts should be put forward, how much effectiveness should be there when they talk about adaptation, the support they need in terms of finance to reach their goals above, and taking all these talks and for taking forward these steps for implementing Paris Agreement. Lastly, the phase 3 will be starting subsequently in 2023, which talks about the consideration of outputs. So once the information is collected and technical assessment is being done, the parties will be informed for updating their NDCs and how each of these parties can enhance the international cooperation. So global stocktake will be a key to have this as successively participating for international cooperation and taking good assistance from developed countries. So coming to these, we look forward into some research articles which talks about few recommendation and new proposal that we should be come forward to. So one that we would like to represent is the need of regulatory change. Because as we all know about the principle of equity, principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective responsibility, there is a responsibility from developed nation that should come up. So when we talk about 5-year plan and evaluating each of these talk, that might be difficult for long-term goals that we talk about for developing nations, because developing nations like India is not well equipped with their assistance, and they are not able to do research because of issues in not having finance and to take place this evaluation in this small period of time. And of course, when we talk about our long-term goals, and the other regulatory change needs to be updated is about the rule book. So the calculation of stock, that how it should be done is not very much clarified. So these needs to be done as quickly as possible. Then second recommendation is provisions of enabling conditions, which talks about how the provision of finance can be calculated when we talk about global stocktake, and how that should be dedicatedly represented, because the global stocktake aim is to have a provision on finance consistency for climate action. So that has to be clear, and a significant data and research gap filling should be restructured and talked about much more when we talk about the global Stocktake. And lastly, the major recommendation that should talk about is the international cooperation, the positivity in international cooperation in terms of finance, technical assistance, bilateral, multilateral cooperation, and etc. So these are the few issues that we would like to raise in our policy brief. And here we end our presentation, and I would like to hand over the mic to Anuradha. Thank you, Anuradha. Uh,
Thank you all. I'm just going to quickly ask Mr. Rashmi to come in and begin the panel discussion. Mr. Rashmi is a distinguished fellow in TERI. And so Mr. Haq is just joining, so you can start with the next speaker. So I think you're on mute.
Rashmi, all the best to you. Anuradha, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manjeev, and thank you, Anuradha. It's an excellent panel which we have today. We are waiting for Professor Salim Haq to join us. In the meantime, we have just got a snapshot of what are the key issues in the 4 areas which we are going to discuss today. The issues relating to global goal on adaptation, the loss and damage, the global stocktake, and most importantly, the issue of climate finance. It was very reassuring to hear Ambassador Wael Hamid when he talked about the issues of climate finance and adaptation. These were the 2 key themes which he mentioned in his perspective from the Egyptian side. So that obviously is the most fundamental issue which is going to dominate the discussions in COP27. We have had and we have got a spate of NDCs which have got updated in the recent past, but now the time has come to grapple with this issue of global goal on adaptation. What kind of outcomes we can expect there? How can we incorporate the issues relating to loss and damage, and then support them with the means of implementation? So to discuss this, we have an excellent panel with us, and I have my co-chair, Professor Fakhr Abdul Khawad here. Welcome, Professor. It will be interesting to hear your views. If you have anything to say something as by means of an opening remarks, you're most welcome, and then we'll go over to the panelists.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rashmi. Hello, everyone. I would like to extend my gratitude for the organizer of such a great webinar. I really appreciate their effect in making this fruitful dialogue happen. I once again understand and value the importance of this webinar and apologize for the technical difficulty experienced by the Egyptian government representatives. We don't operate with WebEx in Egypt, and it was a bit difficult adapting to it. I'm sure it will be the beginning of more cooperation and achieving in COP27, and we will have more opportunities to roll together. And now we can start the session.
Sure, Professor Fakhr. That was really important to create a platform where we can converse with each other easily. Now, let me, while we wait for the Professor Salim Haq, let me now go over to Dr. Tariq Samraz first, who is a professor in the Suez Canal University, and he has been involved with drafting of the National Biodiversity Plan in Egypt. He has been with the JEF, and he has also been an advisor to the former Minister of Environment. So he brings a rich expertise in the issues relating to the ecosystem management, and that will be very important from Egyptian perspective and from the global South perspective. So can I ask him to touch upon the issues relating to adaptation, which he thinks are a key, and what kind of outcome can we expect at COP27? Professor Chamras, are you here with
Thank
us?
you, thank you, Dr. Rashmi, and thanks for hosting the event, Terry, and all of the colleagues attending. Just before I look to your question and ask it and reply to it, I would like just to give in a nutshell what does it mean loss and damage from our perspective as university professors. And it's like a dilemma when we have to identify first what we mean by the definition, because we know there is a difference between loss and difference between damage to the assets and infrastructure, while loss itself is connected to various meaningful words. And this was actually the debate before the embarkment of the loss and damage in the first in COP13 at Bali to be enrolled, and then reaching to what we call it Warsaw International Mechanism. And then we went through there all the way through to identify how the global north can cooperate with the global south without leaning on or using any word that may be used in future litigation. And this is actually the problem. The global north identifies the current situation and the impact which we all can see on different perspective on different countries, from South Africa northward to Germany, and from America in the west even to China and India in the east. So it's all hitting everywhere. But to identify this, all the international cooperation went through various steps, from Warsaw mechanism, going through Santiago network for damage and loss, and then all the way through to Glasgow Pact. And all of this resulted in the need to identify the definitions, the need to identify a mechanism, a financial mechanism to support all of this, and to rely on information come from real scientific research to quantify all the loss and damage. Because nowadays losses and damage is not connected only to what we call it extreme heat event, but also it can result in, as Professor mentioned, in biodiversity loss, which takes a long time to happen. And currently we are facing what is happening now in Sri Lanka as one of the countries that adopt a broader goal that needs a lot of support financially to achieve it, and result in miscalculation, which result in food risk that result in instability on the political event. So loss and damage is not only meeting or facing the sea level rise, or meeting or facing extreme heat event, but it can reach to facing the impact on food security and normal crops. And this takes us to what we can do to face this. And I believe in India as well as in Egypt, we have more or less the similar situation. Both India and Egypt are on the ranking of most vulnerable country. Egypt is like 107 and India is 111. Both India and Egypt have a low emission, not low emission, that means low, but low compared to the developed global north. Yes, we still have emissions, but not the same magnitude to the global north. and we are receiving a huge impact from climate change that result in loss and damage in our countries. So we nearly have the same situation with common understanding and common cooperation. So one of the, I guess, as a university professor or academia, that Egypt is going to focus on, it's from my own perspective, it's not related to the government. But because I attended the last year COP in Glasgow, I found that the role of non-governmental organization was extremely crystallizing and powerful to help the government, especially the developing country, to raise their voice and to reach an agreement. And I believe that the Glasgow dialogue was achieved because of the lobbies from the NGOs that succeeded to put an pressure on the UK presidency. So they returnally come with the announcement of the Glasgow Pact and try to speak about, yes, we have a Glasgow dialogue and it will be held on every sessional of the year, and it will be concluded in 2024, and we will be a mechanism to identify how we are going to speak on loss and damage. So I believe the awareness as well as the building of knowledge at NGOs with the right scientific support, it will help all of us as a developing country to deliver our message and voices to the global north that we need the support both technically and technologically for not only mitigation and adaptation, but only to use it for the reducing of the loss and damage. This is from one point. And from the other point, to return back to your questions, I believe all of the scientific community in all of the global south is now relying on nature-based solution. Nature-based solution is not only a tool to rehabilitate or to alleviate or to capture the excess of CO2, but it's also a tool to revenue generation for the local community. I believe in Kenya they have a splendid example on mangrove cultivation as well as coral reef conservation, and they use it to support the local community. In Egypt nowadays, we are thinking about mangrove rehabilitation. I believe in India you have similar cases, and it's rather like not only building a huge wave breaker, but we can simply rehabilitate mangrove to do this function as well as to support local communities. And I was lucky to go to visit India and to take a look at the various stands of mangroves there. Thanks for hosting the event, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thamraz, for your thoughts on this subject. You have emphasized the role of the NGOs, the civil society, in bringing up this issue of loss and damage, highlighting this, and also the need for scientific data to convert the estimation of the losses from the global to the national losses, and project them for the purpose of financing and support which is required, and nature-based solutions. I hope these thoughts get into the adaptation communication of some of the leading countries of the global south, which would pave the way for articulation of the entire framework for measuring adaptation and the loss and damage. Thank you very much. Let me now go over to Ms. Daljit Kaur, who represents, who is actually the Climate and Environment Advisor with the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And she brings rich experience of having worked in the area of climate resilience. She's actually working on some of the projects in India at the moment. Coming from the perspective which Dr. Thamraz just laid out, Ms. Kaur, how do you see the scenario panning out at Sharm el-Sheikh? What are the key issues in terms of climate resilience and adaptation, and how do you think we can really reach this objective of having an adaptation goal at the global level, which would permeate the adaptation actions at all across all the countries?
Thank you very much, Mr. Rashmi. I'm really delighted to be here amongst the eminent experts in the field. I'll just start with a very brief overview of what happened in COP26 and then lead up to the question that you've asked. I represent an organization which is a UK organization called FCDO, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And as you know, UK was the COP president and is the COP president at the moment before we hand it over to Egypt. So as COP president, UK wanted to secure more global action and ambition on adaptation and resilience, and more financing, obviously, towards these actions. This focus actually led to a step change in political commitment on adaptation, loss and damage at COP26. And some of the highlights I'm sure everybody knows is the launch of Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program. In short, we call it GLASS, that aim to enhance adaptation actions and support and contribute to the global stocktake on adaptation. The second bit of success came around the adaptation finance because we saw commitments from donors to double 2019 levels of adaptation finance by 2025, and also provide an update on how this will be achieved in the 100 billion delivery plan. Additionally, Article 6 outcomes included allocation of 5% of proceeds from the newly established International Carbon Market Mechanism, which is again a good thing for the adaptation finance news. Thirdly, restating the need for more finance, especially to address loss and damage. There was a lot of momentum around establishing a finance facility around loss and damage exclusively, which didn't happen, but we did saw setting up of a Glasgow dialogue to discuss funding arrangements further, in the run-up to COP27 as well, an agreement on finance to provide technical assistance to put in place effective actions to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage through the Santiago network. UK remains focused on delivering on COP26 commitment, and my organization, the FCDO, is using its country network, political levers, technical expertise, and the official development assistance programming to empower national, subnational, and local actors and systems to integrate climate risk into policy and investment decisions. Just continuing on this brief overview, it is apparent that adaptation gaps are massive, and we've heard our earlier guests and speakers talk about that extensively. But we've also seen in the last decade that we've made significant progress on building better understanding of the local communities on the nature of risk, and have also improved planning capacities within state and the subnational level. But yes, the gaps on financing the adaptation needs in the last decade has tremendously increased. We see climate impacts, climate crisis increasing in these years, and so the adaptation needs and the action increasing with the financial needs increasing as well. Again, the earlier speakers have spoken about how mitigation gets all the focus in the climate finance pot. Also adaptation does not have a single universal matrix to capture adaptation impacts across countries, contexts, and populations. So the question actually is, can countries really set targets that lead up to setting up a global goals on adaptation, and how can we report on their progress collectively? I would say that there is definitely a need to follow a two-way process, which is a feedback process, understanding the local needs that feed into the GGA methodology, and also unpack how GGA itself can inform and direct actions and funding to make countries more resilient. An important aspect is also to empower local communities to develop their own goals for the global community to listen to them. The goals on adaptation needs to be bottom up and validated by the vulnerable communities. I mean, I think it's equally important for them to be scientific, but to also have the community perspectives into creating these goals. And the process definitely needs to be fair and flexible. We've also heard people talk about there is lack of data with countries, and we shouldn't penalize countries for the lack of data and the capacity. In fact, we should have developed countries supporting developing and low-income countries in progressing or monitoring actions against the global goals. From the India perspective, adapting to climate change and disasters definitely remain India's top priority. Fiscal requirements, as we've seen in NDCs, is around 206 billion between 2015 and 2030 for adaptation efforts. And climate adaptation in India only sees around 4.4% of total climate funding coming towards it, whereas mitigation gets 91%. Also, adaptation of finance comes primarily from public funds. Private sector contribution is negligible, and I don't know how that can be improved, but yeah, that's an area I think which needs to be focused. India is already developing its national adaptation plans. They've set up a core committee. They have ministries on board, and they're discussing on what needs to come in the national adaptation plan. They're also reviewing the financial needs for having a national 10-year-long national adaptation plan, and considering including adaptation actions in its long-term strategies as well. At COP26, I think India would push for support towards specifically increasing public and private sector funding on concrete ANR actions, shifting private finance towards climate resilient investments. I hope they will also push for expanding protection against climate-linked disasters through insurance, social protection coverage, and investments in early warning systems. FCDO is specialized in doing this, and we're working working closely with the Government of India on these aspects. We can share learnings around our program and our work maybe later in the chat box or in other forums. Lastly, transitioning to a cleaner, resilient economy that supports India's development needs. I mean, we've been hearing India still has to meet its development needs. There are huge gaps in that, and we need to take that into account when we're designing any sort of a climate action. I would actually end by sharing 4 guiding principles from the Global South perspective that may be useful for this conversation. One is definitely to prioritize the most vulnerable countries and poorest communities, including women and marginalized groups, and support them to lead adaptation action. Also focus on scaling evidence-driven, equitable, and impactful approaches which respond to feedback and avoid maladaptation measures. Build coherence and leverage synergies across stakeholder groups, sectors, and geographies. And lastly, implement UNFCCC mandate within the bounds of Paris Agreement and Glasgow Climate Pact, responding to the self-identified priorities of developing countries. There are several expectations, I'm sure, which the other panelists will talk about, but I'll end here and I thank you and give it back to you.
Thank you, Ms. Daljit Kaur. That was very interesting to get specific nuggets and glimpses of how you look at the adaptation actions unfolding in India and some of the other countries in the Global South. You emphasize the role of local communities in preparing an adaptation response. That's really critical, and I'm sure the countries are looking at it in their adaptation communication and the final plan they will be preparing. The principles which you have outlined are important, relevant, but the adaptation is one issue on which strongly resonates with the issue of equity across the globe. And in fact, all the countries of the globe are currently affected. So it's very important to see those who are critically affected by the climate change and suitably come up with a compensation mechanism or a funding mechanism for them. We have just been joined by Ms. Coco Warner from the UNFCCC, the Secretariat, and she is an expert on the issues relating to loss and damage. So while we speak on the issue of adaptation, loss and damage, it will be extremely enlightening to hear her thoughts of how the Secretariat and the international community is looking at this issue, and what is it that we can expect from COP27 on this particular subject.
Thanks so much, Professor Rashmi, and hello to everyone. It's a real privilege to join you today. Thank you for the invitation. So, to the question of what to expect, I'll describe what we know and a few things that we saw in the June climate discussions. And I won't speculate at all because I think there's a huge world of opportunity ahead that will have a lot to do with how all of you in your different roles and wearing your different hats, you'll actively play a role in shaping whatever happens in the future. So here's what we know. We know on loss and damage, there is a Glasgow dialogue. Many of you participated in this dialogue in the June session, that's SB 56. There was a lot of feedback that came to the SBI chairwoman about how those dialogues were organized and how they could be organized in the future. And so that's one really nuts and bolts way that for those of you who have thoughts, particularly parties, but also those of you who show up as contributors or observers, if you have thoughts about how these next parts of the dialogue are shaped, what the agenda looks like, you could refer those thoughts to the SBI chair. So that's just one very practical thing. You could convey your thoughts in writing, for example, either an email or a letter, and that can then be routed to the SBI chair. So that Glasgow dialogue will reach its culmination in 2024. And so that, of course, is one avenue to kind of have that conversation about what needs to be done in this policy area. And that may include finance. We hear finance being discussed from the minister level down to the technical level, and of course, all of you as experts. Another area that we know is the negotiation of terms of reference and operationalization of the Santiago Expert Network. Again, many of you are actively shaping this idea. What should the expert network do? How would it be operationalized? And there's been a lot of discussions, particularly this year, on the Santiago Expert Network. That will be something that will continue to be negotiated at COP27. A third area that parties will hear about, and of course all of you, is the work under the constituted body, the executive committee. That executive committee was set up some years ago, as you know, to operationalize the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. That committee meets next week. Many of you are going to participate either in person or virtually at that meeting. Now, something, as you know, that will be happening is the WIM-XCOM will be looking at its work plan. We have a 5-year rolling work plan, and the 5 years are now kind of culminating, and it's time to renew that work plan. So your thoughts, and active constructive participation at the WIM-XCOM is welcome and an interesting way to contribute your idea. So those are the three things we know: the Glasgow Dialogue on Loss and Damage, the Santiago Expert Network, how should it be operationalized, and what role would all of you like to play in that expert network so that countries are supported in their efforts to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. And then, of course, the third, parties will receive the annual report of the executive committee. And as part of that annual report, there will be some thoughts about this renewed 5-year rolling work plan. So that's what we know. Something else materialized in the June mid-year climate negotiations. There is a request by a major group of parties that would like an agenda item to be considered. And this is something that, of course, the incoming COP presidency, they're very attuned to party needs and wishes. And the incoming COP presidency, along with the current COP presidency, have been doing consultations all throughout the year to hear more about party wishes, about loss and damage. So that's something that you may hear about. There are a number of ways that that could play out. But again, the desire of G77 in China, that was a letter that they've written. They would be interested in seeing a loss and damage agenda item. And so I think that's all in the future. We have to see how that plays out. I hope that these aren't too boring details that I'm sharing with you. You may have all of that. Just a little bit of a look ahead. What other big things are happening in the UNFCCC process? And I mention this because all of the scientific evidence that we're reading in the IPCC 6th assessment report, all of your work with frontline communities, and of course policy, these strands of conversation, practice, policy, and work with institutions, they all weave together. And it's helpful then to see the big picture. In implementing the Paris Agreement, we have now 5-year cycles, and we're about to culminate the first about 5-year cycle. It's a little longer than 5 years. But next year, the global stocktake of the Paris Agreement will culminate. And that will result in a stocktake by parties of all of these different areas, and loss and damage is included in that global stocktake. And so what one might expect is that global stocktake may point the direction for future policy and action moving forward. So the global stocktake is also an important conversation for this question about what do we do about adverse climate impacts. Another 5-year cycle is means of implementation. As all of you know, the way that the Paris Agreement was designed was there's a 5-year cycle to check in how are parties doing collectively towards the Paris Agreement objectives, which is in Article 2, the temperature goal, adaptation and resilience, and low greenhouse gas pathways, and then of course means of implementation. So you'll be hearing about post-2025 finance. You'll be hearing about capacity and technology. And of course, since some of you are thinking about finance and what that means for loss and damage, that's another conversation area to keep your eyes on. And of course, I know many of you are actively involved. Maybe that's enough to say at this point. Professor Rashmi, back to you, and whatever we can do as a secretariat to be helpful to all of you, to connect your ideas with the parties that we're all striving to serve. Just signal however we can be helpful, and good luck.
Thank you, Ms. Warner. Thank you for, the last 2 points that you made about the fact that the loss and damage is still not lost. It is still on the table. It is still under active consideration. That's something which is, which everybody is looking at it with great degree of optimism and great degree of interest. So it will be important, I'm sure, the voices which we are hearing today, the Egyptian, the COP presidents to take this into account and suitably take this issue forward. And global stocktake is certainly one of the possible ways, as you said, to anchor this issue and take it forward in a very structured manner. But there are a number of course, imponderables here, and surely as we go along, we will deal with them. Thank you very much for giving us the nitty-gritty of how this issue can be flagged and taken forward. Let me now invite Dr. Jogi Parikh, who is a very well-known and eminent economist. She has been, she is currently the Executive Director of Integrated Research and Action for Development. This institute is a very important one, and they have been involved with a number of high-level studies on clean growth, long-term low-emission development, and currently they are also a part of several such studies. I'll invite her to share her thoughts on the key issues which are going to emerge in COP27. Of course, there is a large range of these issues. I'll not restrict her to a particular issue, but given her experience, I would request her to give her vision about what COP27 might be able to do in terms of finance and the global goal of adaptation. Over to you, Dr. Parikh.
Dr. Parikh, mute.
I have, yeah, okay.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Right. So let me, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm very happy to join you here. I wanted to bring out a few things that we have done recently also, but in general, we find that narratives are not quite correct. Not only they lead to inequity, but they are also not fair. When you say, when you talk about, okay, your emissions are rising, but ours are falling, then we have to say that it is due to cumulated emissions that global warming is taking place. And so we need to think in our metric should be cumulated emissions and not the emissions. So we about coming to climate finance, we suggested that everybody pays money for climate action based on their cumulated emissions. So so every country should pay that much, and of course so we have 52 gigatons of emissions, but cumulated emissions are 700 gigatons. So you have, even if you charge $1 per ton, you have $700 billion. They are not all for climate finance to give away, but they could cover considerable amount of finance within the country, and for developed countries there should be some percentage laid aside for polluters pay. Now polluters pay principle should be applied to the climate finance going outside of your country, because that is a principle in which their own country is doing this. And I'm not saying emissions, historical emissions, that time you didn't know what it is doing, but I am just cumulating from 1990. So that was our deal for climate convention, and climate convention took place in 1992. So nobody can say we did not know. And so that's one aspect. But second is that loss and damage and climate finance can then go a long way. We are also looking at adaptation. Now, adaptation does not have the revenue stream as the mitigation people. So there are at least some companies who benefit from mitigation, but that is not quite the case. Who pays for adaptation and so on. And also because of the scale, mitigation is getting cheaper. The LED bulbs got cheaper, of course, by our action in India, which went into upscaling by millions of bulbs, and that scale brought it down. But there are many, the solar prices are falling, wind prices are falling. So when the action increases, the price can fall. So adaptation, if you can think of a way to modularize it, so that and that there are some similar dangers in all countries. So there are ways to do urban development, ways to do farming, limiting farming emissions and so on. And one could think of this in a serious way in the innovation part. We're talking about innovation, and innovation should be shared at least in when we are sharing everybody's emissions bad part of it, then we should also share the innovation. And innovation, shared innovation can go a much longer way, and many more people can benefit and will implement it. So that is an adaptation is becoming very serious for many developing countries who did not actually emit till world average per capita level of emissions. So, which is about 3 to 4 tons per 4 to 5 tons per person, keeps changing. Now it's about 4.5. So, but many India has about less than 2 tons per capita and so on. So I'm not saying that everybody should go up to world average, but at least those who didn't go, they are below average, should get some reliefs, some consideration, and so on. So I think that while we meet in Cairo, if some of these concepts are clear, the climate dialogue can move further. Otherwise, you insist that it is some other countries who have to do this, and also another thing people have started now about net zero emissions, and which is a good thing, okay, but it is not precisely defined, because even if you say 2050 or 2060, 30, 40, whatever you say, there is many pathways to go to net zero, and these pathways may not be the direct pathways. Some go up and then go down, some go steady and then go down, and so on. So each case cumulative emissions are different. So people say, okay, in that case, let's to look at the peak year, and this year at least there is some improvement, that there are 2 years given there. But even then, after peaking, you may not come down. And you think that suddenly you will do so, and you may not, and so on. So there are many uncertainties about net zero, and not only that, but also how you treat, say, sink emissions. There is no clarity on who is thinking of what kind of sink emissions when they say net zero. What are they setting it against? Because and in any case, even if all countries go to net zero to where they when they said they would, let's say assume that will happen, even in that case, from currently 700 gigatons, it would go to 1400 gigatons just by going on the way emissions, even fairly direct way. So it is also not quite a solution. So we need to be aware of these problems ahead of us, and take climate action far more seriously, and address the equity issues, and not wait for saying until everybody does, I will not do it, because those who have emitted more and accumulated more need to take steps faster. Thank you so much. I think.
Thank you, Professor Parikh, for your thoughts, wide-ranging thoughts on the subject of how we can, anchor this issue of equity in terms of emissions for the purposes of generating finance, mobilizing finance, and raising general level of, engagement of all the countries. Thank you very much. Let me now hand over the stewardship of this panel now to my colleague, Professor Fagar, from to take this discussion forward. And we still have 4 or rather 5 panelists. If Professor Salimul Haq is able to join us, then we will have, I think, the full and complete panel. So, Professor Fagar, now the screen is yours, and you can take the discussions forward. And let me thank all the panelists at this stage.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rashmi. And thank you to all the panelists for their fruitful knowledge. I believe we all benefited from them. We will now begin the second part of the panel discussion. And the first two speakers will be discussing finance and climate finance respectively. Climate finance refers to local, national, or transnational financing drawn from public, private, and alternative sources of financing that seek to support mitigation and adaptation actions that will address climate change. Our first speaker is Ms. Yashka Malik, who will be talking to us about finance.
Thank you, Dr. Fagra. Am I audible?
Yes. So if you could answer, what do you think is the biggest challenge in mobilizing finance into climate change adaptation? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. So I would want to, first of all, give a context and a background and structure my arguments in three sort of pillars. So the first one is about climate vulnerability and adaptation, because we're talking about financing, so adaptation is critical. So India, we all know that India suffers high economic and social costs due to climate vulnerability, climate extreme events, and climate shocks. And it is highly exposed to hazards as well and has a very limited coping capacity. And these economic losses due to extreme events have doubled in the last decade. And unfortunately, the poorer states carry a disproportionate burden. We've also witnessed severe heat waves, which are expected to increase eightfold by 2050, various hydromet disasters, and socioeconomic impact, which will have impact on poverty and which will lower the living standards for over like 50% of the population by 2050. Now, the first thing that India needs to take forward is the resilience approach rather than a reactive approach to these climate extreme events. And the World Bank is supporting the national and state governments using a systems approach to building resilience. And Resilient Kerala Initiative, Odisha Partnership have been some of the examples. And there was a recent report launched on coastal resilience by the Bangladesh team. But deeper reforms are also needed in terms of resilient new infrastructure, resilient water resource management, stronger early warning systems, improved dry land agriculture and crop production, better protection of mangroves in the east and west coast of India on the adaptation side. And all of this certainly require a large chunk of finance, but to start with, they need granular risk analysis and profiles to support planning and prioritization of these adaptation actions and investments. And this was also highlighted by Dr. Tariq. The total government spending on adaptation action has certainly grown consistently in the last decade, and it is expected to reach about $360 billion by 2030. But India needs stronger finance and technical capacity for design and implementation of adaptation projects, particularly at a local level. Now, coming to my second point, which is like development agenda versus the climate agenda, and where the finance should go into. So India's ambitious climate announcement are not only, it will not only help the global climate goals, but it is also critical to accelerate its own economic growth and social well-being, because the impact of climate vulnerabilities will stay on, as I mentioned earlier. And this includes India's commitment towards life, which is lifestyle for environment, which focuses on promoting sustainable production.
And I would like to, reiterate our country director's word from a recent address that there is no climate finance. Actually, development finance is what needs to be looked from a climate lens. And as most of you would be aware, that the World Bank Group has delivered a record 31.7 billion in the last fiscal year to help countries address climate change. And that is about 36% of its total World Bank Group financing. And in order to advance India's ambition in climate and development transitions, there are also two core diagnostics that we are working on. One is a country economic memorandum, and the second one is a country climate and development report, which will look into implementation of India's green transition, including adaptation, resilience, finance, institution, and just transition. And coming to the last and the final, or the most important pillar or point, which is finance, we know that more than 80% of financing would need to come from the private sector. And India needs to deploy stronger financing and technical capacity for the design and implementation of these climate resilience projects, particularly at a local level. So identifying scalable climate finance instruments such as green credits, subnational climate funds, to mobilize, a greater climate finance and devise mechanisms to incentivize conservation, restoration, regeneration of degraded natural resources and other adaptation actions is the need of the hour. And this can be done through innovative green crediting mechanism, which widens the focus from only carbon-based credits. So I'll stop there in the paucity of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Yeshka. And now, thank you so much for your expertise and for showing us the issue of climate finance in India and illustrating India's perspective on mobilizing climate finance. Next up, we have Mr. Arjun Dutt, the program lead in the Center for Energy Finance. And the question for you is, how do you think we can overcome the lack of the climate finance in the current situation? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Fagr, and thank you for having me on this panel. It's certainly perhaps one of the most important questions for the climate debate going forward, and a number of speakers before me have flagged the issue of financing, and particularly in this particular forum, we're talking about adaptation. So I'd like to maybe point out 4 specific points to that need to be addressed, or that can sort of form the guiding principles in terms of how to look at the climate finance debate, particularly when it pertains to adaptation. Let me start firstly by just giving a few numbers, because of course the OECD recently released its compilation of climate finance flows for the year 2020, which are the latest available figures. Of course, the top line number of 83 billion is still considerably short of the 100 billion number. That, of course, has already been discussed. But what is pertinent here is that if we look at the share of adaptation versus the share of mitigation in these figures, the share of adaptation flows was about 1/3. 34% was the share of adaptation, about 58% was the share of mitigation, and the rest was cross-cutting, divided between mitigation and adaptation. Now, previous speakers, Ms. Yeshika, she has mentioned that the share of adaptation or the adaptation absolute flows have been rising. But firstly, in terms of whatever is the overall climate finance that delivered, the share of adaptation should be much higher. I mean, there should ideally be a 50-50 split between adaptation and mitigation. And of course, the overall flows need to be higher. So overall flows need to be higher, and the share of adaptation also should be much higher. So from about 1/3 right now to at least 50%. So that is the first sort of thing that I'd like to point out. A second point that I'd like to make is that one of the previous speakers mentioned that the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement has also provided provisions for financing of adaptation through the share of proceeds, where every transaction under the 6.4 regime would require 5% of the credits to be transferred to a fund where they can be used for funding adaptation. Now that is a progressive development, but what is lacking is that only one part of the Article 6 pillar, that is 6.4, has a mandatory transfer of proceeds towards adaptation. So 6.4 is a centralized market mechanisms where carbon credits can be traded. Of course, there's another market mechanism, that is the 6.2, where internationally traded mitigation outcomes, or ITMOs, can be traded between countries. And in this case, countries are only strongly encouraged to transfer funds towards adaptation, but are not mandated to do so. So this is an easy, straightforward gap that should be addressed. Why should one Article 6 mechanism be mandated and the other only strongly encouraged? So this is a simple sort of gap to be addressed in the overarching sort of Article 6 framework and how it seeks to address adaptation finance. Point number 3. So, of course, we understand that the climate finance flows themselves from developed countries have not been forthcoming to the extent that they have promised. In addition, the current macroeconomic environment also is not conducive for developing countries expecting significantly enhanced flow of finance in the near term. And why I say that, of course, is that, of course, many developed countries are suffering an economic downturn, are headed towards recession. There are elevated levels of public debt across developed and developing countries. So in general, public finance or public capital that can be deployed towards supporting sustainability is in short supply. So what we need are mechanisms that maximize the utilization of each dollar of public capital. Each dollar of public capital that is used to capitalize adaptation or climate finance instruments should mobilize many multiples in terms of private sector investments. And one way to do that is to apply blended finance approaches where you are de-risking investments for private sector investments rather than directly investing funds into specific end users. So again, I'll circle back to the climate finance flows to illustrate this point. So the latest figures for 2020 say that public climate finance flows were about $68 billion. And the private capital that they mobilized was only about 1/5 of that, about 13 billion. So clearly, this public capital is not being used to catalyze more private capital. Rather, it is being used for direct lending and investment purposes. So a smarter use of this public capital through catalytic blended finance instruments that can mobilize many multiples in terms of private sector investments is necessary to make sure that each dollar that is being deployed towards climate finance is doing a lot more in terms of mobilizing private sector capital. So these were the first 3 points, and these particularly pertain to how climate finance support that transfer between developed and developing countries should be better utilized. A final point that I'd like to make is, and one of the previous speakers also raised the point as to how to get private sector investors or private corporates to actually invest themselves into adaptation activities, because often these are not commercially viable activities, and a for-profit organization will only act if it is in their self-interest. So by and large, they will act if only it is in their self-interest. So it is incumbent upon regulators, particularly mainstream financial sector regulators, to create an environment that directs them to proactively manage climate risk, and thereby this could trigger an acceleration of flows towards mitigation and adaptation. Now, this is only possible if exposure to climate risk, both transition and physical risks, affects their cost of capital, that is the cost at which they raise finances for their own operations. So how do we do this? What is needed is the greening of finance, that is the internalization of climate risk into the operations of corporates. So India's central bank, the RBI, recently came out with a discussion paper on climate risk identification and management for banks. Similarly, regulators should require corporates to manage their climate risk much better as per standardized frameworks such as the TCFD that have global applicability. Regulation, if it also explicitly provides for factoring in sustainability and ESG considerations into companies' credit ratings. The credit ratings that are ascribed to companies by credit rating agencies. If there is an explicit mandate, regulatory mandate, to incorporate ESG factors into these credit ratings and complemented by a standardized framework for doing so, this process could also hasten the flow of capital towards activities where it was not currently flowing, such as adaptation. This would be because such regulation would elevate the cost of borrowing for companies that have greater exposure to climate risk, that are not investing in adaptation activities to safeguard their operations. And therefore, if such regulation is implemented, it can increase the relative attractiveness of sustainable activities, both mitigation and adaptation, and compel private sector enterprises to invest in those activities, because ultimately it is in their own self-interest. They are mitigating climate risk, which, as most of us now understand, is a material business risk, even for the private sector. So that is the fourth point: getting financial regulation to create conditions for private sector to invest in climate-related activities, and particularly adaptation, since we are talking about adaptation on this forum. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Arjun Dutt, for discussing climate finance with us and discussing various obstacles that face mobilizing climate finance and making it as efficient and effective in climate change adaptation. We now have Dr. Himangana Gupta discussing loss and damage. Dr. Himangana is the manager of the Sustainable Landscapes and Restoration Program at the World Resources Institute in India. And my question for you, Dr. Himangana, is what approach do you think needs to be taken, or a different approach needs to be taken to address the loss and damage caused by climate change? Dr. Himangana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me first. And I know there has been a lot of discussion on loss and damage by now, and also loss and damage finance, mitigation finance, adaptation finance, and everybody is quite bored of the discussions that might have been happening. But yes, your question about the approach is very interesting. What approach should we take? The problem is that we are not taking any approach. We have not decided on any approach on loss and damage as yet. And I just go back to a comment by Mr. R. Rashmi, who after Ms. Coco's remarks on what has been happening during the CCC loss and damage dialogue, she told many things that were already happening, and then Sir said that okay, loss and damage is not lost, and we are happy to know that. But we know on the ground there's a lot of loss that is happening, a lot that is already being damaged. So when I read loss and damage, I read it as lost and damage, and that is some problem that is emerging from the huge global north and south divide, which is going to take this debate much longer to end, because of which we are not really able to zero in on the finance facility that was being expected in COP26. And I'll just go back on the Glasgow dialogue, which is being discussed. And last year, as a part of the Indian delegation, I was attending the loss and damage agenda item. And I remember how many hours of negotiation went into deciding just 2 functions of Santiago Neighbor. There's a lot of resistance on anything that you ask or question. So, which is why Glasgow damage and finance facility was very much difficult to achieve in COP26. But Glasgow dialogue, which was established during COP26, that was just, it was a consolation prize because we couldn't get the loss and damage finance facility done. And this dialogue was supposed to start in the June session, which I did not attend. But the demand for the developing countries was to put it in the formal agenda item during the SP session as well, and also during the COP27 session, which is going to happen. But there was a lot of repulsion, and something that you have to decide about has to be formally put in the agenda item first. So that is the first step to even start negotiations, and that did not happen during the June session. So it's not the first time that things go back and something that is decided on the decision, something that's written on the decision, because we are already falling short of the $100 billion goal that was supposed to be met in 2020, and now given 4 more years to even think about it and arrange that kind of finance. So we are definitely falling short. Going back to why loss and damage, now we're talking about loss and damage. It's actually not now, it was back in 1991 when AOSIS tabled a proposal for putting loss and damage as a part of the UNFCCC. Of course, UNFCCC recognized it, but the kind of the financial arrangements did not become a part of that. Problem was that mitigation was considered most important by the countries. That yes, we are going to mitigate first, and that is the something we'll reach this much temperature goal, and there will be no dangerous anthropogenic interference. But the dangerous anthropogenic interference started, and the developing countries, they started saying, okay, adaptation is important because we don't have enough life jackets to protect ourselves from what is happening. But the developed countries, they're somehow ready. So let's now focus on adaptation. Adaptation finance became important. So earlier, the entire finance that was, focused on mitigation, even Jeff, GCF, they started putting some finance to adaptation. And last year, we had this decision of doubling finance adaptation, which is very good, of course. But when we talk about adaptation shortages, mitigation shortages, let alone loss and damage, who cares? That's a thing of the future. But we know what's happening on the ground. But on the negotiations, we are actually, living in the history when we talk about that, because we are not talking about slow onset events. We talk about sudden calamities. When certain countries talk about humanitarian aid, that is more about rapid onset events, not about slow onset events that we need preparedness for, which are more linked to climate change. So today we are actually at the brink of loss and damage, and the global climate risk, of course, it tells how much loss has happened. It says that 475,000 people lost their lives as a direct result of more than 11,000 extreme events globally from between 2000 to 2019, and the losses amounted to US $2.56 trillion. So we know that this climate finance need is visible, and just like climate change itself. But yes, the decisions, when we sit on the negotiation table, we forget all this, and we just talk about we want to give this finance, we don't want to give this finance. So much so that one topic that has not been touched until now in this discussion is about the governance of the loss and damage, the Warsaw International Mechanism for the Loss and Damage. So this governance item last time could not be decided because developing countries want the governance to be under the larger umbrella of the UNFCCC, and the developed countries want it to be under the Paris Agreement so that there is no liability as per some provisions of the Paris Agreement. So the problem is that, and the Article 8 of the Paris Agreement, it does say that the WIM shall be subject to the authority and guidance of the CMA, but this sort of became a reason for debate, and till COP25 there were divergent views about this, about between developed and developing countries. There was a huge divide, and then even India and other developing countries as well, they have a strong stand on dual governance, saying that COP and CMA both should be guiding WIM, because it's you have to comprehensively avoid, minimize, and address loss and damage. And there are certain provisions of UNFCCC which are important to keep in mind when we talk about this. That's the Article 4.8 of the convention. It says that UNFCCC shall give full consideration to actions necessary to meet specific needs and concerns of developing country parties arising from adverse effects of climate change. This is a very important thing that was noted back in 1992, and something that could have been taken forward, but later on the liabilities were removed from the Paris Agreement, which became a reason for concern. So not going too much into the detail, we've discussed what are the important matters regarding the loss and damage finance facility and the governance. I'd just say that what is important, what we could look forward to during COP27 is that at least loss and damage comes at the agenda in COP27, and countries, at least they're able to discuss, negotiate in a very positive manner a kind of loss and damage facility that could happen, even if it uses the existing institutional mechanisms that we have regarding the financing. And we need to obviously differentiate between loss and damage. Like Yeshika mentioned that there is no climate finance, it's development finance, and that kind of development finance was 0.7% of GNP that was promised long time back by the developed countries. But then, we started talking about climate finance, and then Jeff came in as an interim entity. Then, GCF we have, but we have mitigation adaptation finance. It's very difficult to differentiate, and at a time when we talk about joint mitigation and adaptation approaches, I think it becomes very difficult to differentiate mitigation finance from adaptation finance. So we need to be careful that what comes as a loss and damage finance is not actually adaptation finance. And when we talk about resilience building is in a way actually adaptation finance. It does not talk about, it talks about minimizing or averting, but it does not address loss and damage. So that is one of the problems. We need to also differentiate between humanitarian aid post-disaster and also the way resilience building can be done to reduce the impacts of loss and damage, different from what is done for adaptation. And then how to use existing infrastructure and institutional mechanism for loss and damage finance to basically support developing and most vulnerable, and I should say they call it particularly vulnerable countries. So that kind of assessment has to be done. Vulnerability assessment will decide who are those particularly vulnerable countries that are supposed to get the finance. Then ensure that such finance is new and additional to the already made and delayed financial commitments. And we need to keep in mind slow onset events, human mobility. By mobility, I mean migration, and including the migration. IPCC says that the climate change related migration will first increase within the borders, and then there will be cross-border migration as well. So that is something that we need to keep in mind when we talk about loss and damage, because those kinds of human rights related to climate refugees will be related to loss and damage. We need to talk about non-economic losses as well, because like Professor Jogi Parikh, she mentioned that adaptation, basically it's not quantifiable as mitigation is. So adaptation and loss and damage both are related also to non-economic losses, which we do not account for. That is something we need to think about. And then I don't know if it can, but I saw there are certain research papers. Some scholars are studying the role of insure resilience in loss and damage. Although nobody wants to, invest in sort of insurance for loss and damage because they know climate-related loss and damage is going to increase in future. But what role, if it can, play in the loss and damage? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Himangana, for the incredibly knowledgeable discussion in differentiating adaptation and mitigation finance and loss and damage finance, and the importance of financing the loss and damage caused by climate change, and how vital it is for all of us, and especially in India. Next up, we have Professor Anand Patwardhan in the School of Public Policy, the University of Maryland, and he will be discussing the global goal on adaptation and COP27. My question for you, Professor, is what do you think that needs to be achieved in COP27 to improve all of our progress, India and Egypt, our progress towards the global goal of on adaptation? Dr. Anand, Professor Anand, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. I hope I am audible. Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Fagar, and dear friends and colleagues. To begin, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to TERI for inviting me to this virtual dialogue. Though the time difference poses challenge, at least technology allows us to overcome the constraints of distance. So it's possible for me to share some thoughts with you all. I must congratulate TERI for their initiative in organizing this dialogue. The upcoming COP, in terms of expectations, is really very significant and consequential for a number of reasons. So in the 6 years since a COP was last held in Africa, climate change has become ever more of a clear and present danger, happening in the here and now, rather than a problem of the remote future. But at the same time, as the IPCC AR6 reminded us, with an ever more rapidly narrowing door of opportunity to respond, not only for mitigation, but equally for adaptation. So it's really essential that this COP, therefore, move us firmly towards action and implementation, not just words, not just commitments, not just feel-good mid-century net zero targets, but real concrete actions in the here and now, so that we can walk through that door of opportunity before it closes on us. In that spirit, in response to the question that you posed, I wanted to share some thoughts about the one key process that was kicked off at COP26 in Glasgow, which will conclude at COP28 next year, but for which COP27 could serve as a really critical midpoint. And that is the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the global goal on adaptation, GLAS as it is referred to, and the GGA. So in my view, the GGA process emerged out of a well-justified frustration in the developing world about the lack of concrete progress on adaptation and, of course, adaptation finance. And many other speakers have talked about adaptation finance already. However, rather than engaging in a contentious and perhaps eventually fruitless renegotiation of the GGA, let me suggest 3 ways in which that conversation and the GLAS could concretely advance and accelerate action on adaptation and resilience, which is ultimately what we all actually want. First, we need to recognize that for all its vagueness and imprecision, we do have a global goal on adaptation, in itself a major achievement of the Paris Agreement. And this imprecision is actually perhaps a blessing in disguise because it allows countries the flexibility to operationalize and apply it in ways that is best suited to their contexts and needs. Therefore, our focus now ought to be on how we take this global goal of reducing vulnerability, strengthening resilience, and building adaptive capacity and use it to develop appropriate national strategies for adaptation and appropriate national and subnational goals and associated metrics and indicators. This is a major and non-trivial undertaking, given the huge diversity in national circumstances and the wide range of climate hazards. It will require strong engagement of the research community, including perhaps a role for the IPCC. Just as the IPCC was instrumental for formulating guidelines for greenhouse gas monitoring and inventories, it could well develop guidelines and identify best practices and methodologies that could be applied at and across different scales, from the local to the national and the global. Second, we need to recognize that the GGA is a global goal. What does that mean? It means that there is an expectation of global collective action, not just the aggregation of actions from local to national scale, but actions that the global community can take and support. I would argue that a very important outcome of COP27 could be that the global community commits to securing basic universal enablers of resilience, big no-regret solutions that would enable adaptation and resilience at all scales. For example, universal access to early warning systems is a key enabler. And for this goal, the UN Secretary General has already called on the WMO to develop a 5-year plan. Another key enabler is climate information. Universal access to the right climate information at the right scale and in the right form could make risk visible to decision makers and is in fact a global public good. Other examples could be a global effort to restore coastal wetlands and mangrove systems to support coastal resilience and universal access to some form of social protection and livelihood support. Like the SDGs, these UERs or universal enablers of resilience could be real tangible options to make progress on the GGA. And finally, the GGA is a global goal on adaptation. For over a decade now, since the IPCC's 5th assessment report, adaptation has been conceptualized as a process of iterative risk management. And risk management, as we understand it, includes risk reduction, prevention, and relief and compensation. And the latter conceptually is nothing other than loss and damage. Within countries, loss and damage is not a new concept at all, whether it is handled through private markets such as insurance or through public funds such as disaster relief or compensation. It is an essential element of the risk management toolbox. There are, of course, complex questions of who pays, how much, for what, and under what circumstances. But these questions of implementation arise in the case of other risk management options as well, whether risk reduction or hazard prevention. Perhaps recognizing that loss and damage is a legitimate element of the overall adaptation agenda would help advance both the adaptation agenda and the loss and damage agenda itself. Finally, I would be remiss if I did not say a word about what is the elephant in the room, and that is climate finance. While it is welcome that COP26 kicked off a process to determine a new collective quantified goal on climate finance, I believe it is equally important to focus not only on the mobilization, as others have done, but also on its delivery and effective use. And this leads us directly to the performance of the main operating entity of the financial mechanism of the convention, the Green Climate Fund, which in the case of adaptation has been underwhelming, to say the least. Much of this, I believe, stems from the artificial dichotomy between adaptation and development. Is it adaptation or is it development? that has led to added complexity and unnecessary burden in developing countries for project development. The net result has been that even where resources exist, getting them out to vulnerable communities has proven to be difficult. Despite efforts by the GCF to simplify its requirements of the climate rationale of projects, the fundamental change needed is the recognition that adaptation is closely interwoven with the development agenda. In the language of the IPCC AR6, what we are seeking is climate resilient development and not an adaptation increment over a conventional development baseline. What COP27 needs to deliver is clear guidance to the GCF to move from a fruitless definitional debate over whether an intervention constitutes adaptation or constitutes development to a more pragmatic question of cost sharing and co-financing. Progress on unlocking this flow of finance for adaptation resilience could well be the most far-reaching outcome of COP27. Thank you very much. Lovely to be here.
Thank you so much, Professor Anand, for the knowledge and for allowing us to further understand how we can use COP27 to allow us to reach the global goal on adaptation and landmarking important points such as climate finance and how important it is for us to progress further. And with this, we conclude the panel discussion session. I will now hand over the floor to Dr. Shaylee Kedia, the Senior Fellow at TERI, to give us all the closing remarks. Shaylee, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Bhagar, and thank you so much to Mr. Rashmi and Bhagar both, who chaired the panel discussion, and to all the panelists who have given such valuable perspectives going forward to sow the road to Sharm el-Sheikh, as the event is titled. We definitely see very important four broad messages, which at least I, just to kind of try to sum it up quickly. One is that in this road, there is definitely an elephant, in the room or on the road, which is climate finance. And I mean, we've seen from examples in Egypt and India that even until the time frame of 2030, the need for adaptation finance is so huge. And that is why climate finance, including, with specific focus on adaptation finance, is so important when we look at the finance related negotiations. But the principle of additionality cannot be lost, and definitely no funds from development finance that will be kind of very tricky, but can't be diverted or considered as, kind of climate finance. I think that's a very important principle that must not be lost. In terms of global goal and adaptation, yes, since it's a universal goal like the SDGs, collective reporting, at a global level is important. Whether, and going to from the point, very concrete suggestion coming from Professor Patwardhan on like looking at indicators such as universal access to early warning systems. This could be one concrete goal that, a metric that could kind of, be agreed on at an international level. Third two, which is on loss and damage, and as Mr. Rashmi summed it up, that perhaps loss and damage, at least as an agenda item, we do hope is not lost. And one has to build on the Glasgow dialogue, the previous, the Santiago network, the Warsaw mechanisms, and this really has to be concretized. Now, of course, the debate is still open. Like, some people would like to consider it separate from adaptation, but whether it's a part of adaptation, loss and damage, but nevertheless, it should not be lost. That's very key to, in terms of when we go forward to, I'll talk about the road to Sharm el-Sheikh. Then finally to global stocktake, and while of course this is going to be finalized in the next COP in UAE at the COP28, it must be rooted in the principles of equity and CBDR. And I think like it's very kind of this is just a small dialogue that TERI initiated. Post the dialogue, of course, to all the experts and speakers who participated. We will be circulating a questionnaire, if you want to provide any further inputs, because we know the time was short. So there will be a scope for further inputs. And that's all from my side, and all your inputs will be collated in a policy brief as well. And but I mean, that's all from my side. But before I hand it over to Anuradha, who is so brilliantly emceed, and my colleagues, have joined, I'd just like to check with Mr. Rashmi and further if there are any final words you'd want to say, and then we can close up this event. Mr. Rashmi.
No, thank you, Shelly, and we are done. And absolutely, it was a fantastic discussion, wonderful discussion, and people are really in the chat box. They are appreciating what you have done, the range of thoughts, stimulating discussion, and a new idea that have come up. Particularly, the last intervention by Professor Atwardhan, he did concretize and bring sharp focus to some of the issues which are likely to emerge in Sharm el-Sheikh, and to my co-chair colleague, Professor Fagr, I thank her for coordinating this discussion so well. Thank you to all of you.
Any final words from you, Professor Fagr?
Firstly, thank you, Dr. Shaley, for your incredible organization of this webinar and cooperating with all of us and working so hard to make it happen as smooth as possible. To Professor Rashmi, thank you so much for hosting the panel discussion and making it as well run very smooth and making sure that it is very organized. To all the panelists and the experts that have spoken, thank you for your knowledge and expertise. I'm sure that we all benefited from every single one of you and every single topic that was discussed. And I look forward to seeing you more often and working together with all of you, as well as seeing you hopefully at COP27 and to more and more collaboration between Egypt and India. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Fagr, and thank you so much to your Center for Climate Change and Sustainable Development at the National Research Center in Egypt, who have been our partners in organizing this event. And we do hope to continue our association further along with the COP27 presidency, as well as the Embassy of Egypt going forward to Sharm el-Sheikh. And to all of you, audience and dear colleagues, thank you so much for being here. And, we look forward to continued engagement with all of you. So thank you. I think we can close this event now. Sonali?
Yeah, Sherry. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.